Men today have more freedom than ever and feel more alone than ever. They can choose their careers, their lifestyle, their path. No pressure to marry, no expectations to settle down. And yet, something is missing. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet moments, after work, after the gym, after everything is done. There's no one to call, no one to talk to, no one who really knows them. And the deeper truth, this isn't happening for the reasons most people think. And this is where things start to get uncomfortable. Because if you look closely, it isn't just about men being alone. It's about how that loneliness is formed, slowly, almost invisibly. It doesn't happen all at once. There's no single moment where everything breaks. It's built over years, through routines, expectations, and patterns that seem completely normal. And the most dangerous part, most men don't even realize it's happening while it's happening. But before we go deeper into that, there's something you need to understand first. Because most people still imagine loneliness as something obvious. They picture isolation, silence, a life that clearly looks empty. But that's not what male loneliness usually looks like. Most of the time, it looks functional. It looks like a man who handles everything. He works, he shows up, he pays bills, he solves problems. His life moves forward. And from the outside, nothing seems broken. That's exactly why this goes unnoticed. The modern version of male loneliness doesn't look like collapse. It looks like compression. A man's life slowly organizes itself around usefulness. His time becomes efficient. His conversations become practical. His identity becomes tied to performance. And without any clear turning point, connection starts to fade. Not because he rejected people, not because he stopped caring, but because everything around him quietly rewards function and quietly neglects friendship. And that distinction changes how you see the entire problem. Because when people talk about men and loneliness, they often reduce it to personality. They say men don't open up, that they don't communicate, that they don't try hard enough. And while that sounds reasonable, it misses what's actually happening underneath. Because men don't start adulthood disconnected. They become disconnected through a series of small, almost invisible adjustments. Nothing dramatic, nothing that feels like a mistake, just decisions that make sense in the moment. Work becomes more demanding. Deadlines matter more. Performance matters more. Stability becomes the priority. And naturally, time starts getting reorganized. Less spontaneity, more structure. Less, let's just hang out. More, we'll see when there's time. And at first, nothing seems lost, because life is moving forward. But something subtle begins to shift. Connection is no longer built into the day. It becomes something that has to be scheduled. And what has to be scheduled often gets postponed. Now layer something else on top of that: relationships. For a lot of men, especially in their late 20s and 30s, a romantic relationship becomes the central point of connection. Not because they consciously decided to replace everything else, but because it's efficient. One person to talk to, one person who understands your life, one person who shares your daily reality. It simplifies everything. And for a while, it works perfectly. You don't feel disconnected. You feel grounded, because connection still exists. It's just concentrated. But concentration creates fragility, because when most of your emotional connection is tied to one place, everything else starts to fade in the background. Friendships don't end all at once. They thin out. A message that used to get answered immediately now takes 2 days. A plan that used to happen every week becomes once a month. Then we should catch up sometime. Then silence. And what makes this dangerous is that it doesn't feel urgent. There's no clear loss, no moment where you think something is wrong. It just feels like life. And this is where the pattern becomes hard to see. Because from the outside, everything still looks normal. The man is still functioning, still working, still progressing, still handling responsibility. So nobody questions it. And he doesn't question it. Until something changes. Sometimes it's a breakup. Sometimes it's distance. Sometimes it's just time passing. And suddenly, the structure that held connection together is gone. And what's left isn't just emotional loss, it's absence. Because he looks around and realizes something unexpected. There's no one integrated into his daily life at that level anymore. No one who knows the details. No one who sees his life in real time. And that realization doesn't always come with a dramatic reaction. Sometimes it shows up quietly, in a moment where he has something to say, and no one to say it to.
And if you've ever experienced something like that, even in a small way, you know how specific that feeling is. Not overwhelming, just empty in a very precise way. And that's why this conversation around men and loneliness often feels incomplete, because it focuses on emotion but ignores structure. It tells men to open up, but doesn't ask a more important question: open up where? Because connection isn't just about willingness, it's about having a place where connection actually fits into your life. And this is where the pattern starts to turn in a way most people don't expect. Because if you look closely, the traits that make a man successful are often the same traits that slowly isolate him. Discipline, independence, self-sufficiency, emotional control. On paper, these are strengths. They are rewarded at work. They are respected socially. They are encouraged early. But over time, they have a side effect. They reduce the necessity of connection. Think about it. The more disciplined a man becomes, the more his life revolves around goals. The more independent he becomes, the less he relies on others. The more self-sufficient he becomes, the less he asks for help. And the more emotionally controlled he becomes, the less he expresses what's actually going on inside. Individually, each of these improves stability. Together, they reduce shared experience. And that shift doesn't feel negative, it feels efficient. Life becomes smoother, more predictable, more controlled, but also less connected. And here's where it gets subtle. A man doesn't wake up one day thinking, "I'm becoming isolated." What he feels is something harder to name. Conversations become shorter. Interactions become more functional. Time with others becomes something to fit into a schedule instead of something that happens naturally. And over time, he adapts because it works. He becomes more focused, more composed, more self-contained. And from the outside, that looks like growth. But internally, something else is happening. Because when emotion has nowhere to go, it doesn't disappear, it compresses. And this is why many men don't describe what they're experiencing as loneliness. They describe it as stress, or fatigue, or just being tired all the time. Because the signal gets translated into something more acceptable, something that fits the identity they've built. And that translation matters. Because if you mislabel the problem, you respond to it incorrectly. If a man believes he's just overworked, he rests. If he thinks he's burned out, he takes a break. But if the real issue is disconnection, rest doesn't solve it. And this is how the cycle reinforces itself. The more stable his life becomes, the less space it leaves for connection. The less connection he has, the more unfamiliar it feels to pursue it. The more unfamiliar it feels, the less likely he is to reach for it, until eventually connection stops feeling natural altogether. And here's where it goes deeper, because without consistent external reflection, people who see you regularly, who know your patterns, who notice your changes,
your internal world starts to narrow too. You still function, you still think clearly, you still move forward, but you're doing it in a kind of closed loop. No feedback, no outside perspective, no one interrupting your narrative about your own life. And over time, that creates a strange effect. A man can become highly capable and quietly disconnected from his own emotional reality, not because he lacks depth, but because there's no environment where that depth is engaged. And once you see that, the question changes. It's no longer just, why are men lonely? It becomes, what kind of life slowly removes the need for connection without you even noticing? And this is where the problem becomes even clearer. Because at this point, it's not just about time, or priorities, or personality. It's about something more fundamental, a missing model. Most men were never taught how to maintain connection without a reason. They learned how to connect with someone through work, through shared activity, through solving a problem together. There was always a context, a reason to interact, a reason to be there, a reason to stay. And because of that, connection felt natural. It didn't need to be initiated directly. It didn't require explanation. It didn't feel like effort. It just happened in the background. But adulthood changes that, because the structures that used to generate connection automatically start to disappear. You're no longer in the same place every day. You're no longer surrounded by the same people. You're no longer sharing the same routines. And now, connection has to exist on its own, without a task, without a shared mission, without a built-in reason. And for many men, that's unfamiliar territory. Not uncomfortable in an obvious way, just undefined. There's no script for it, no clear sense of how often to reach out, no instinct for how to maintain closeness without a shared activity holding it together.
So it gets delayed, or minimized, or reduced to surface-level interaction. And over time, something subtle happens. A man can be around people and still not feel connected to any of them. He shows up, he participates, he contributes, but he doesn't fully arrive, because the interaction never moves beyond function. And when connection is always tied to function, identity starts to follow the same pattern. A man begins to see himself primarily through what he does, what he produces, what he solves, what he handles. And the parts of him that don't have a clear function slowly become less expressed, not because they disappeared, but because there's no environment that brings them out. And this is why the advice to just open up often doesn't translate into real behavior. It assumes expression exists independently, but for many men, expression has always been contextual. It emerges when there's a shared space that supports it. Remove that space, and expression has nowhere to go. So it stays internal, unprocessed, unshared, not because it's being actively suppressed, but because it was never structured to exist freely in the first place. And over time, that creates a deeper form of disconnection, not just from other people, but from parts of themselves. Because if there's no environment that invites certain parts of you out, those parts go quiet. They don't disappear, but they stop being accessed. And this is where the experience of loneliness becomes more complex, because now it's not just about not having people, it's about not having a place where you can exist beyond what you do. And that changes how you see everything that came before. Because now, the issue isn't just effort, it's not just opportunity. It's the fact that many men were never given a model of connection that survives adulthood. And once that model disappears, there's nothing there to replace it. And this is the point where everything starts to come together. Because if you step back and look at the full pattern, the conclusion isn't what most people expect. Male loneliness is not simply the result of men being alone. It's the result of how men were conditioned to build their lives. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but systematically. From early on, men are taught to become stable, to become capable,
to become reliable, to handle things, to move forward without needing much from anyone else. And those lessons work. They produce men who can function under pressure, who can solve problems, who can carry responsibility. But they also produce something else. Men whose lives don't naturally include connection as a structural necessity. And that's the key distinction. Because when something is not structurally necessary, it becomes optional. And what's optional is often the first thing to be sacrificed when life becomes demanding. That's why this isn't just a personal issue, it's structural. A man can go through his entire day, work, train, eat, manage responsibilities without needing deep connection at any point in that cycle. Everything still gets done, everything still works. And because nothing breaks, nothing forces change. So the pattern continues. Less connection, less shared experience, less sense of being known, until eventually a man is living a life that functions perfectly but doesn't feel fully lived. And this is where the conversation needs to shift. Not why are men lonely, but how did we build lives where connection became optional? Because once you see that, a lot of things start to make sense. Why friendships fade. Why relationships carry so much weight. Why breakups feel like losing an entire support system, not just a person. It's not random, it's structural. And this is why surface-level advice doesn't work, because it tries to change behavior without changing the structure that shapes that behavior. It asks for change at the surface, while leaving the underlying structure unchanged. And without changing the structure, the same pattern keeps repeating. Different men, different circumstances, same outcome. Because the conditions haven't changed. And this is the moment where the entire conversation becomes clearer. Male loneliness is not an anomaly. It's not a side effect. It's an expected outcome of how modern male life is organized. And once you understand that, you stop looking for simple fixes and start asking better questions. And once you start seeing the pattern clearly, the conversation changes. Because now it's no longer about fixing men. It's about understanding what kind of life actually supports connection, not in theory, but in practice. Because connection isn't something you add later. It has to be built in. And for many men, that idea is new. Not complicated, just unfamiliar. Because they were never shown what that looks like without structure. So the real question becomes, what does a life look like where connection isn't optional? Where it doesn't depend on convenience? Where it isn't tied to performance? Where it exists alongside everything else? Because once you start thinking in those terms, you begin to notice something.
Connection isn't lost all at once. It fades when it's not reinforced. It weakens when it's not integrated. It disappears when it's treated as something secondary. And that doesn't happen because men don't care. It happens because their lives were never designed to hold it in place. And maybe that's the part that has been missing from the conversation. Not that men are doing something wrong, but that the system they're operating in doesn't make connection inevitable. It makes it optional. And optional things are easy to neglect, especially when everything else feels urgent. So this isn't about going backwards. It's not about recreating the past. It's about recognizing what changed and deciding whether it's worth rebuilding differently. Some men won't, and that's a choice. Others will start to notice the gap more clearly. In quiet moments, in small absences, in the feeling that something is missing even when everything looks fine. And for those men, the question becomes more personal. Not what they were told, not what is expected, but what kind of life they actually want to build. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And maybe that's where the shift begins. Not with a dramatic change, but with awareness. So I'll leave you with this. When you look at your own life, does connection exist by design,
or only when everything else slows down? Let me know in the comments. I read them, and I'm genuinely interested in how you see this. And if this kind of perspective helps you understand things more clearly, subscribe, because this channel isn't about quick advice. It's about understanding the patterns most people overlook.